Well, Arrival was directed by Denis Villeneuve. It was made in Canada. It's very recent. It was made in 2016. And it's a first contact film. So this is a common sci-fi trope. It's about aliens coming to Earth, what that would look like, what the conflict is like, that kind of thing. So I wanted to write about Arrival because I found it fascinating. I had actually already read Story of Your Life, which is the short story it's based on by Ted Chiang. And I found it really, really interesting, partly because in sci-fi as a genre, I have often felt like there's this really common human-centric narcissism that accompanies a lot of first contact films. You know, like the idea of little bobblehead aliens with bodies just like ours but green and oblong heads. And that is really radically different here. I felt that Arrival was a film that was really trying to genuinely imagine what other beings might look like and how they might communicate. Every aspect of it is imaginative and interesting and feels much more real than a lot of films. And I think another film that does this is 2001, which is one of my other favorite films of the course. Yeah. So my thesis is about subjectivity in the scientific process and how Arrival really emphasizes the importance of the insertion of the self in science and the very individual perspective. Louise Banks's personal life is totally intrinsic to her scientific process here, and all of her scientific breakthroughs are made through intimate personal relationships and connections that are made through communication, linguistics, which is her field. Yeah, and I also talk about how the film uses linear time as a meta-narrative, which is a concept in postmodernist philosophy. And the film aligns itself with that by using a narrative to understand how we tell stories and how we tell stories about history, about science, that sort of thing. And so instead of, so the film challenges this idea by proposing an alternative to understanding discourses in this way. Instead of using linear time as a meta-narrative, it proposes non-linear time as a way of understanding the world in a way. And when you look at the world through this meta-narrative of non-linear time, through this idea of postmodernist theory, all of these major themes of free will, mortality, love, regret, intelligence that you see in a lot of science fiction films come into question. The scientific process in Arrival is really different from our modern ideas of science that we've kind of inherited from the Enlightenment era belief of what science is looking for. And it is, in a way, where it prioritizes subjectivity, the personal, the intimate, and really isn't involved in this condemnation of the self and self-insertion that I feel like is a classic idea of science right now, and is depicted in a lot of science fiction films and a lot of, just in our real world. I feel like that's really stressed in science, this removal of the self and identity and kind of controlling factors. So I think that that idea of objectivity is really noticeably absent in Arrival. And in fact, the subjectivity of the scientific process is absolutely vital to the linguist Louise Banks coming to these conclusions and understandings about the world and about the situation, and ultimately preventing large-scale war and strife in the world. Yeah. Yeah, so the role of the linguist is very interesting because I don't think people always think of linguistics as science. But she's definitely in a scientific role here. There's a process that she articulately plans out, and she works with a physicist also. And what they're trying to do, their purpose in this scientific process is to figure out why the aliens, the heptapods, have come down to Earth. And so her role is to communicate. And that's part of the subjectivity here, and that's why that aspect of it is so important. It's this very personal thing, communication. And that is really central to the film. The idea that understanding is really benefited by relationships. And she definitely develops these really profound relationships to the heptapods that ultimately are the reason she is able to solve her scientific problem. So the linguistics that she develops with the heptapods is basically learning each other's languages, which is also symbolic and all of that, but it also ends up being the catalyst for Louise Banks thinking in an entirely new way, because the language is based on the Zapper-Whorf hypothesis, which is the idea that language kind of determines the ways in which we think, and this is definitely true in Arrival. Louise Banks, her conception of time is entirely changed by the language of the heptapods, and she no longer experiences time as linear by the end of the film, and that's where her scientific breakthrough comes in. I think science fiction is really interesting because it's so, I feel it really recognizes this really apparent intertwining of philosophy and science, because it encounters, there's no way to not encounter philosophical questions in imagining what science might look like in the future. And it really kind of confronts those questions head on, I feel. Science fiction is a really helpful tool to kind of teasing out the real heart of philosophy and science, the ideas of what science is looking for, what truth is, what knowledge is, where we want to go as a society, where we want to be in 100 years. And it helps us look at where we were 100 years ago. And I think that's really important. I definitely think scientists should engage with science fiction. I think it's an important way to recognize the larger beliefs of your discipline as a whole, and the dangers of where that discipline can lead. The ethical questions behind things like cloning, genetic mutations, extraterrestrial contact, space travel, all of those things are really interesting and really important for scientists to consider, especially when you're in a discipline that is very focused on logical thinking and process. It's important to consider larger, more abstract questions, and I think science fiction is a really easy tool to start thinking about those things.